Jawaharlal Nehru, The War of Democracy. In Asia and Europe and Africa, and over the vast stretches of the Pacific and Atlantic and Indian Oceans, war has raged in all its dreadful aspects. Nearly 7 years of war in China, over 4.5 years of war in Europe and Africa, and 2 years and 4 months of World War. War against fascism and Nazism and attempts to gain world dominion. Of these years of war, I have so far spent nearly 3 years in prison, here and elsewhere in India. I remember how I reacted to fascism and Nazism in their early days, and now I only, but many in India. How Japanese aggression in China had moved India deeply and revived the age old friendship for China, how Italy's rape of Abyssinia had sickened us, how the betrayal of Czechoslovakia had hurt and embittered us, how the fall of Republic Spain after a struggle full of heroic endurance had been a tragedy and a personal sorrow for me and others. It was not merely the physical acts of aggression in which fascism and Nazism indulged, not only the vulgarity and brutality that accompanied them, terrible as they were, that affected us, but the principles on which they stood and which they proclaimed as loudly and blatantly, the theories of life on which they tried to fashion themselves. For this went counter to what we believed in the present and what we had held from ages past. And even if our racial memory had forsaken us and we had lost our moorings, our own experiences, even though they came to us in different grave and somewhat disguised for the sake of decency, were enough to teach us to what these Nazi principles and theories of life and the state ultimately led. For our people had been the victims for long of those very principles and methods of government, so we reacted immediately and intensely against fascism and Nazism. I remember how I refused a pressing invitation from Signor Mussolini to see him in the early days of March 1936. Many of Britain's leading statesmen who spoke harshly of the fascist duke in later years, when Italy became a belligerent, referred to him tenderly and admiringly in those days, and praised his regime and methods. 2 years later, in the summer before Munich, I was invited on behalf of the Nazi government to visit Germany, an invitation to which was added the remark that they knew my opposition to Nazism and yet they wanted me to see Germany for myself. I could go as their guest on privately in my own name or incognito as I desired, and I would have perfect freedom to go where I liked. Again, I declined with thanks. Instead, I went to Czechoslovakia. Instead, I went to Czechoslovakia, that faraway country about which England's then Prime Minister knew so little. Before Munich, I met some of the members of the British cabinet and other prominent politicians of England, and ventured to express my anti-fascist and anti-Nazi views before them. I found that my views were not welcomed, and I was told that there were many other considerations to be borne in mind. During the Czech-Slovak crisis, what I saw of Franco-British statesmanship in Prague, and in the Sudetenland in London and Paris, and in Geneva, where the League Assembly was then sitting, amazed and disgusted me. Appeasement seemed to be a feeble word for it. There was behind it not only a fear of Hitler, but a sneaking admiration for him. And now it is a curious turn of fate's wheel that I and people like me should spend our days in prison while war against fascism and Nazism is raging, and many of those who used to bow to Hitler and Mussolini and approve to Japanese aggression in China should hold aloft the banner of freedom and democracy and anti-fascism. In India, the change is equally remarkable. There are those here are as elsewhere. There are those here as elsewhere, governmentarian who hover round the skirt of government and echo the views which they think will be approved by those who favor they continually seek. There was a time not so long ago when they praised Hitler and Mussolini and held them up as models, and when they cursed the Soviet Union with bell, book, and candle. Not so now, for the weather has changed. They are high government and state officials, and loudly they proclaim their anti-fascism and anti-Nazism, and even talk of democracy. Though with bated breath as something desirable but distant, I often wonder what they would have done if events had taken a different turn, and yet there is little reason for conjecture, for they would welcome with garlands and addresses of welcome whoever happened to wield authority. For long years before the war, my mind was full of the war that was coming. I thought of it, and spoke of it, and wrote about it, and prepared for myself mentally for it. I wanted India to take an eager and active part in mighty conflict, for I felt that high principle would be at stake, and out of this conflict would come great and revolutionary changes in India and the world. At that time I did not envisage an immediate threat to India, any probability of actual invasion. Yet I wanted India to take her full share, but I was convinced that only as a free country and an equal could she function in this way. That was the attitude of National Congress, the one great organization in India which consistently for all these years had been anti-fascist and anti-Nazi. As it had been anti-imperialist, it had stood for Republican Spain, for Czechoslovakia. It had stood for Republican Spain, for Czechoslovakia, and throughout for China. And now, for nearly 2 years, the Congress had been declared illegal, outlawed, and prevented from functioning in any way. The Congress is in prison. Its elected members of the provisional parliaments, its speakers of these parliaments, its ex-ministers, its mayors and presidents of municipal corporations are in prison. Meanwhile, the war goes on for democracy and the Atlantic Charter and the four freedoms. Time in prison, the urge to action. Time seems to change its nature in prison. The present hardly exists, for there is an absence of feelings and sensation which might separate it from the dead past. Even news of the active, living, and dying world outside has a certain dream-like unreality and immobility and an unchangeableness as of the past. The outer objective time ceases to be, the inner and subjective sense remains, but at a lower level, except when thought pulls it out of the present and experiences a kind of reality in the past or in the future. We live, As Auguste Comte said, dead men's lives incest in our past, but this is especially so in prison where we try to find some sustenance for our starved and locked up emotions in memory of the past or fancies of the future. There is a stillness and everlastingness about the past. It changes not and has a touch of eternity. Like a painted picture or a statue in bronze or marble, unaffected by the storms and upheavals of the present, it maintains its dignity and repose and tempts the troubled spirit and the tortured mind to seek shelter in its vaulted catacombs. There is peace there and security, and one may even sense a spiritual quality. But it is not life. Unless we can find the vital links between it and the present with all its conflict and problems, it is a kind of art for art's sake, without the passion and the urge to action which are the very stuff of life. Without that passion and urge, there is a gradual oozing out of hope and vitality, a settling down on lower levels of existence, a slow merging into non existence. We become prisoners of the past, and some part of its immortality sticks to us. This passage of the mind is all the easier in prison, where action is denied and we become slaves to the routine of jail life. Yet the past is ever with us, and all that we are and that we have comes from the past. We are its product and we live immersed in it. Not to understand it and feel it as something living within us is not to understand the present. To combine it with the present and extend it to the future, to break from it where it cannot be so united, to make of all this the pulsating and vibrating material for thoughts and action, that is life. Any vital action springs from the depths of the being. All the long past of the individual and even of the race has prepared the background for the psychological moment of action. All the racial memories, influences of heredity and environmental and training, subconscious urges, thoughts and dreams and actions from infancy and childhood onwards in their curious and tremendous mix-up inability inevitably drive to that new action, which again becomes yet another factor influencing the future. Influencing the future, partly determining it, possibly even largely determining it, and yet, surely, it is not the determinism. Aurobindo Ghosh writes somewhere of the present as the pure and virgin moment, that razor's edge of time and existence which divides the past from the future, and is yet instantaneously is not. The phrase is attractive, and yet what does it mean? The virgin moment emerging from the well of future in all its naked purity, coming into contact with us and immediately becoming the swelled and stale past. Is it we that swell it and violate it? Or is the moment not so virgin after all, for it is bound up with all the harlotry of the past? Whether there is any such thing as human freedom in the philosophic sense, or whether there is only an autonomic determinism, I do not know. I lost it. A very great deal appears certainly to determine by the past complex of events which bear down and often overwhelm the individual. Possibly even the inner urge that he experiences, that apparent exercise of free will, is in itself conditioned. As Schopenhauer says, a man can do what he will, but not will as he will. A belief in an absolute determinism seems to me to lead inevitably to complete inaction, to death in life. All my sense of life rebels against it. Though, of course, that very rebellion may itself have been conditioned by previous events, I do not usually burden my mind with such philosophical or metaphysical problems which escape solution. Sometimes they come to me almost unawares in the long silence of prison, or even in the midst of an intensity of action, bringing with them a sense of detachment or consolation in the face of some painful experiences. But usually it is action and the thought of action what fuel me, and when action is denied, I imagine that I am preparing for action. The call of action has long been with me, not action divorced from thought, but rather flowing from it in one continuous sequence, and when really there has been full harmony between the two, thought leading to action and finding its fulfillment in it, action leading back to thought, and a fuller understanding than I have sensed a certain fullness of life, and a vivid standing than I have sensed a certain fullness of life, and a vivid intensity in that moment of existence. But such moments are rare, very rare, and usually one outstrips the other, and there is a lack of harmony and a vain effort to bring the two in line. There was a time, many years ago, when I lived for considerable periods in a state of emotional exaltation, wrapped up in the action which absorbed me. Those days of my youth seem far away now, not merely because the passage of years, but far more so because of the ocean of experience and painful thought that separates them from today. The old exuberance is much less now. The almost uncontrollable the almost uncontrollable impulses have toned down, and passion and feeling are more in check. The burden of thought is often a hindrance, and in the mind where there was once certainty, doubt creeps in. Perhaps it just is, as the common temper of our day. And yet, even now, the call of action stirs strange depth within me, and often a brief tussle with thought. I want to experience again that lonely impulse of delight which turns to risk and danger and faces and marks at death. I am not enamored of death, though I do not think it frightens me. I do not believe in the negation of or abstention from life. I have loved life, and it attracts me still, and in my own way. I seek to experience it, though many invisible barriers have grown up which surround me. But that very desire lets me to play with life, to peep over its edge, not to be a slave to it, so that we may value each other all more time. Perhaps I ought to have been a aviator, so that when the slowness and dullness of life overcame me, I could have rushed into the tumult of clouds and said to myself, balanced all, brought all to mind, the years to come seemed a west of breath, the years behind, in balance with the life, this death. Thank you.